Linda, how did you come to start this great exhibit called Chop Suey on the Prairies?
I started talking to people at the museum about Chinese food, and everybody said, oh, well, every small town has a Chinese restaurant. I kind of thought, really? What? Well, let's test that. Let's test that and see if it was true. And it turned out to be true. And in fact, people competed to have a restaurant in their town. It was a sign of the town had arrived. It was a socially neutral space. It was the one place in the small town that everybody could go and congregate. Any other space in a small town is sort of designated by group, right? It's designated by gender. It's designated by ethnicity. The Chinese were subject to so much discrimination socially and legally that they couldn't afford to discriminate against anybody else, So we have stories of First Nations people saying, we went to the Chinese restaurant because they were the only place that let us in.
Wow.
And that's really important in a small town to have somewhere to congregate. So it is the social hub.
Take me back to a little bit of the history of what the Chinese immigrants who built this railroad would have been going through.
What the railway did and the need for workers to complete the railway was allow Chinese immigration in. They actually had to make an exemption to the law. And because of that, once the railway had been completed, that exemption was still in place. So all of a sudden, the Chinese people were starting to come in waves. So this is the next period of Chinese immigration, which kind of goes from 1885 to 1923.
And when did these restaurants start popping up?
They really start popping up 1890s.
So right after that, it was like, all right, restaurants.
That's it. You don't actually tend to see Chinese food on menus until we get to the 1960s, 1980s.
Wow.
It's only when you get to the 1980s that you get that split menu. The hamburger, fish and chips, and sandwiches.
And then chop suey.
And then chop suey, chow mein, and fried rice on the other side.
What do you think motivated that change?
There was a moratorium on Chinese immigration. When we get to the late 70s, early 80s, that is a new wave of immigration. There's a whole new immigration policy. When they get here, they only know how to make Chinese food. Even in the 80s, there was adaptive processes, right? I mean, if you hit Alberta, the main thing that everybody defines as Chinese food is ginger beef.
Ginger beef.
And I'd never seen it before I got to Alberta. And so we actually managed to trace the origins of ginger beef. And it was the invention of George Wong at the Silver Grill in Calgary. His family had come slightly earlier. They'd opened a restaurant. They were expanding. And he was brought over to be a chef at the restaurant. And they wanted to bring authentic northern Chinese food to the prairies. But no one was eating it. He took a look at the market and he invented ginger beef. Because, beef is not a staple of Chinese food.
Right.
But we're in Calgary.
Of course. That right away, that makes sense to me.
Right? So he had to invent something that was based on beef. Right? He'd actually worked in London in pub food, sort of, Chinese takeaways in the UK. Right? And Chinese takeaways in the UK tend to be very sweet and sticky. Right? So he took sweet and sticky and beef, deep fried it, and
then there it is.
Invented ginger beef. Now the ironic part with ginger beef is there's no ginger in it.
Come on.
Nope.
So what's the ginger part?
It's actually, he calls it a sweet chili beef, but the palate in Alberta, which was not accustomed to this food, they tasted it and said, "Can we have that gingery beef thing?"
Oh, come on. That is crazy.
I know. So it's now referred to as ginger beef, and it's, anywhere you go in Alberta, there's a variation of ginger beef, and there's no ginger. I mean, there are those regional variations of Chinese food all over North America. I mean, I think it's really impossible to understate the economic pressure that these men were under.
Of course.
Entire villages in China are being supported by their remittance money. So if you don't make money to send back home, your family could essentially starve.
Right. So you're gonna do everything that it takes. How do you think things are changing now?
Not significantly. I mean, we're still trending on from what the 80s has, right? So you're still looking at menus where it's half Western food, half Chinese food. In
the Chinese restaurant?
Oh yeah. The Silver Grill in Fort Macleod. is, again, has been operating since the turn of the century. You know, they serve pizza and Chinese food.
Oh boy, that's. But ultimately, again, the whole point of a restaurant is it's a business. And if you can't sell what you're cooking, if you're cooking for yourself, then it's not a restaurant anymore, right?
Yeah, and that's the point we were trying to make with the exhibit. You know, a lot of times, I mean, there have been exhibits about Chinese food, but it's always been focused on just the Chinese people and the ethnicity, you know, that angle of it. And we're saying, well, no, if you really look at it, it doesn't matter who owns it, it's fundamentally a business. So a lot of those characteristics that people are trying to find these cultural reasons for, you just go back to, so who's the customer? I mean,
who is the customer?
You know,
absolutely.
They have to sell what their customer wants.
Entrepreneurship, malleability, I think that it really stands the test of time for them.